That was beautiful. Um, the whole book is beautiful. Which I want to talk to you about for hours and hours afterwards. But I do want to say first, it is a beautiful memoir. I mean, the writing is, yeah, I'm speechless. It's beautiful. So thank you for that. I really yeah, it's great. I think, I'm sure you're going to get this question a lot. People, for a long time, people have talked about eating disorders as sort of the underlying cause was this just a need for control. How do you differentiate that need for control from what the kind of need to make oneself small? It's sort of in response to other people's prescriptions about how you should behave. I don't know if that would, yeah. How does this? How do the two sort of theories differ? And sort of why were we stuck in this other one for so long? You know, when you first told me you were writing this, it's funny. My first response as a researcher, knowing what kind of backlash you get when you do research that people don't like, was, holy shit, sorry. This is gonna be a major shift, and some people won't like it because they're used to this old model of understanding disordered eating. So I wanted to just get into that a bit with you. What's different? What's the same in how you see this?
I love that question. Thank you, Amy, and thank you for your comments. Coming from you, they mean everything. My goodness. The book was born of my own desire to understand how I got myself to the point that I did. And it was the process of discovery led me. Sorry, I'm not sure. It was that process of discovery that led me to the conclusions that I came to, and the theory that I posit in the book, that anorexia is not about control. It's about feeling controlled. And the feeling of being controlled comes, I can't argue for everyone, obviously, who has the experience, so I'll always speak to my own experience, and I also want to make it clear I am not a medical professional, so this is all from my own personal experience and conversations with many who went through a similar experience. But the feeling is that you are being controlled both internally from what feels like a voice in your head or an aberrant thought process, and the external forces that you find in your life. Mine happen to be unique and strong from my father, and I'll leave you to read the book to better understand that, unless of course Amy asks about it. But it was, but there were other controlling factors in my life as well. I grew up in a really strict religion, and society itself, I think, has a way of pushing in on young women and defining their space. So obviously there's neurobiology involved, there are genetics involved, and that's beyond the scope of my knowledge to speak about here today. But in terms of whatever trigger or environmental factors play in, I believe that there is a feeling in anorexia that you are not allowed to individuate. You are not allowed to become a whole person separated from the whole people around you. And rather than pushing back on that, which is, I think, a standard process of adolescence, you shrink to the space that you feel like you're allowed to take up. So I argue in my book that recovering from anorexia, it feels like an act of insubordination. Among other things, it feels like failure, it feels like an act of insubordination. It's very challenging to overcome that narrative that you have internalized into a really brutal voice in your own head that keeps you from believing that you can stand alone on your own 2 feet, take up an amount of space in the world, and I don't obviously just mean physically, that, when you look around, a lot of other people enjoy, somehow that feels incredibly out of reach.
This idea of shrinking, is there's a lot of overlap between the kinds of things you and I spend time thinking about, and I spend a lot of time thinking about power and powerlessness. I mean, the psychology of power and powerlessness, not social power, but psychological power. I mean, the feeling of agency, of self-efficacy, how that changes our behavior. When we feel powerless, it activates what we call the behavioral inhibition system. It shuts people down, so they make themselves smaller. They see the world with a scarcity mindset. They're less creative. They're less cognitively agile. When we feel powerful, when we have a sense of agency, it does the opposite. It activates the approach system. So we see other people not as potential competitors or predators, but as allies, as friends. We're more open to them. We're more optimistic. We have an abundance mindset. And we're simply more likely to take action. Like, we are more likely to take up space. And, my work is very much about taking up space. When we feel powerful, we expand. Our bodies expand. We take up more space. It's true across the animal kingdom. It's true across cultures. In lots of different ways. Just think of someone crossing the finish line. What do? They throw their arms up in the air, they lift their chins, open their mouths, they expand as much as they can. So this idea of shrinking, to me, expansion and shrinking, that kind of continuum, is so closely linked to power and powerlessness, agency or lack of agency. And I want to sort of underscore how important I think that piece is in this work. Is when you think about subjective well-being, people tend to think about happiness and stress. So if people are happy and not stressed, we think of them as doing well psychologically, as thriving. But we can't thrive if we don't have a sense of power, a sense of agency, the ability to be what we want to be, to have voice. And in fact, in Norway, for example, one of the criteria by which sort of poverty is defined has to do with how much voice you have in things like changing systems in your community. So I think this shrinking idea is so critically important, and we find also that girls, so when you look at men and women and their body language, you see big differences. Women do take up much less space than men. I wanted to know whether that was innate or learned, and if it was learned, when was it learned? Is this a prescription? And I think the idea of thinking of stereotypes as prescriptive, that's how you should behave, I'm prescribing that, is, I think, more helpful than thinking of stereotypes as just descriptive. So what I noticed, so my son is here, he's 20, and when he was in elementary school, one of his best friends was a girl, and she was like mischievous and rowdy and loud and just a ball of energy, and she took up a lot of space. And I noticed that when they got to middle school, suddenly she was shrinking. She started to pull her sleeves down over her hands, wrap her body, do things like this. And I couldn't believe that this was happening. And my son, his body language wasn't changing, right? Something was happening at that age. So we ended up studying this, and what we found, we showed little kids, ages 4 and 6, because kids learn stereotypes around the age of 5, pictures of art, what do you call them? The wooden art dolls. either in expansive postures or contracted postures. So they looked at 16 pairs of these photos, and we on an iPad, and we just said, point to the boy and point to the girl. Now, these are the same dolls, and we expected the kids to go, it's the same, but they didn't. By age 4, the majority thought that more of the expansive ones were boys than the contracted ones were girls. But by the time they were age 6, that number went up dramatically. And many of those kids thought every expansive one, all 16, were boys, and every contracted one was a girl. So we're learning that stereotype around that age, but we don't start really expressing it until we hit, puberty. And so it was a long-winded way of getting to this issue of I experienced as a kid, my parents wanted me to not grow up. They didn't want me to go through puberty. They wanted me to stay small. They talked about my weight a lot. And, I now see that as a way in which maybe my mom was trying to keep me safe. So I'm wondering about this, the age of onset, and how does it tie to things that are happening in girls' social worlds?
What a fabulous question.
Well, that was
Thank
another
you.
question. It was a bit of a lecture. Sorry about that.
No, it was brilliant. It was brilliant. And I learned a ton, as I always do with you. I love that. I think the tie is almost explicit in how you shared as well. The idea that, I'll start here. I think I argue in the book, and I believe to my core, that it is no coincidence that anorexia affects women 10 times as frequently as men. I think it's also really worth mentioning here the importance of this topic for many reasons, but one of which is anorexia is also the single mental illness with the highest mortality rate, which is terrifying. That mortality rate has only increased since 1952, when it was first designated as an eating disorder in the DSM. Rates across the board have increased, mortality has increased, and that's very scary. I would argue that one of the reasons that is that, first, it's been very difficult to research, and I appreciate those who are making those efforts. I think there's a lot more to be done there, but I absolutely believe that if the population that it affected was something aside from pubescent young women especially, I think something might have been done a lot sooner. I think that there's this expectation that women are meant to shrink at that time in so many ways in their lives, certainly not just physically, and it maps to the experience of anorexia, which is the reason I titled my book Unrestricted. It's a play on a recognition that it wasn't simply food that I was restricting, it was anything that gave me joy, that allowed me to feel empowered, that made life worth living. I got really good because I was trained into it through society and parenting and religion and a number of other really powerful ways to get very comfortable saying no to myself. So to your point, by the time you're 4 or 5 or 6, you already know this dynamic. You've integrated it before you could even think about it, and then you play it out at the very point in which you would start to literally, physically, emotionally, psychologically, intellectually expand. So that is the point at which it becomes really important to shrink.
That is so, that helps me understand our findings a bit. It is, so if kids learn it at age 5, but they're not expressing it yet, what is the change? And you're right, that is when girls expand in many different ways. And so that's, I think, such an important thing to point out. I wanted to just read how you one of the ways in which you kind of defined anorexia. And my eyes are terrible and I don't have my reading glasses, but anorexia is about shrinking to accommodate the space that you've been allowed to take up in your life. The exact amount of space you can hold without making anyone else uncomfortable. Healing from anorexia is an act of insubordination, of self-defense. I must expand into the space that I have been denied, the space that someone else thinks belongs to him. Be assured, he will fight back, accustomed as he is to taking up all the space that he desires, unquestioned and unchallenged. Let's play more with this analogy between, I'll skip there because you need to read the rest of the chapter to understand the analogy that she's about to go into. But I just think that's a beautiful way of describing this as a dynamic. And I think one of the things that the book does is it brings this to life. It is not simple. I mean, it's and it can be it can last a lifetime. But it is this dynamic between you and yourself, and between you and the people in your life who have controlled you, who you feel are controlling you. So I think that's also a really important step forward, because I've noticed that I think people think that anorexia is less common now, because as norms change around what's attractive, we think that girls are just going with what's seen as attractive, and so because super thin is not in right now, we're not seeing any of this. And your explanation makes so much more sense. I mean, it helps us to understand that this is still a problem. This is still happening for the very same reasons. I wanted to ask, you said something about how it is all about restricting and making yourself small, taking things away, denying self. But you also said something about, and I don't know if you used the word joy, but when you're doing it well, when you're restricting well, it feels good. Can you help us understand that, how both of those things are true?
And it's so unfortunate that it's true. You really hope that the experience of nearly starving yourself to death or fully starving yourself to death is a miserable experience. And psychologically, it is a miserable experience. Certainly the worst I've ever had. But there's this reinforcement psychologically of the dark path, the path toward death, that is encouraging to follow that path. And I think that has a lot to do with neurobiology and certainly thought processes. But as I kind of alluded to in even the section that I read, you would hope that it feels terrible to starve, you have no energy, you feel awful, and it feels great to refeed, to establish, metabolic normalcy, homeostasis. You're not worried about, the heart attack around the corner. But it's not true. It can feel, and boy, I hesitate to say this because I would despise the sense of encouraging anything, but the challenge of treating anorexia is that while there is an inherent absolute misery in it, and there is no joy in the process, there is something reinforcing almost along the lines of an addiction in the negative process, and something very challenging and very difficult in choosing the positive path. So when I started to eat again, it was with excruciating pain, for example, and then a lot of psychological berating. So I think that's one of the real difficulties in effectively treating anorexia. And I want to, if it's okay, Amy, I want to go back to one of your initial questions, because I feel like I kind of skipped over it, and I think it's really important. One of the preeminent psychiatrists who read this book and said lovely things inside of it, he told me, boy, you're going right up against the party line. And it's not my intention to go right up against the party line, but I am, and I'm very comfortable with that. My thoughts on that are this: anorexia has been, since its classification, and still is, the deadliest mental health disorder. It affects young women at a rate of 10 to 1 versus young men, and the primary age of onset is age 15 to 20. Of course, there are exceptions to all of these things. We have made almost no progress, and arguably no really meaningful progress epidemiologically in this space. So I feel strongly like this. I was a philosophy undergraduate. When you are working toward a logical conclusion, if you never get there, and we certainly haven't reached a logical conclusion on anorexia, at a certain point, maybe 70 years down the path, you go back and you revisit your axiom. I think it's actually the onus is not on any of us who are saying, hey, subjective experience, to your point, subjective well-being. Listen to people who have been through it who say, yeah, that was nothing like what was going on in my head. I think the onus is on those doing the research and those who are doing their absolute best, with my deepest gratitude, to treat this very difficult disorder, to explain why we're still coming from the same place even when we're getting nowhere. There's not a single pharmaceutical treatment that has shown a positive outcome in anorexia, not one. Not one. And there's one therapy that shows some benefit, but it is hardly widely used. That's not from me, that's from Dr. Tom Insel, who was the former head of the NIMH, is recognizing, hey, family-based therapy is barely used in the treatment of eating disorders, yet it is found to have some benefit. And I would argue the reason for that is the final stage of it is ensuring that the girl individuates. So I think the issue has a lot more to do with what you feel is possible in your world, what the boulders are in your way, and whether you have the self-efficacy and empowerment to climb over those boulders while, either internally or externally you're being beat along the way, or if you do what probably most would do in that situation and just, shrink to the smallest space in which you can exist so as not to engage the wrath or other behavior of others.
Thanks, that's great. I want to share something that happened today, just to underscore how often women get the message that they need to take up less space. I posted on Instagram about this, and I explained what the book was about and the theory, and there were some nice comments, and then there was a guy who basically said, blah, 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 that's nonsense, that's stupid, sit down. And when I pushed back, he told me to sit down again. So, I'm not going to sit down, but I do feel like that message, we still see that messaging. Now, that person did not have good intentions at all, but I've talked, when I talk about gender and taking up space to big audiences that are, 75% men, a lot of fathers come up to me afterwards and say, oh my gosh, I think I've been accidentally telling my daughter to take up less space. Not because I don't want her to be powerful, but I'm afraid that the world won't let her be powerful and she'll be hurt, right? So I feel like I'm protecting her, but I realize that when I say, don't be too, don't be too bossy, don't raise your hand too much, that is sending that message. So can you kind of speak to that? To what can parents do? How can we raise our daughters to feel that they can take up space? I mean, to counteract a lot of the messaging that they're going to get from other places. What do you have to say sort of to parents?
The first thing I want to say to parents is, I don't know how you do it, but I respect so much that you do. I am the parent of a dog and 4 chickens, and that is the extent of my parenting experience. I want to be candid about that. However, as the child of parents who went through this, I think, to become comfortable or competent at anything, you must practice. And the earlier you practice, the more integrated it becomes. I'm looking at two phenomenal musicians over here, both of whom will say, hey, the earlier you start, like absolutely the further you can get, and it is like, it has exponential benefit in your very young years. Otherwise, you're spending the rest of your life trying to catch up, and you'll never make that up. I think that's across the board in so many ways in competence, and that's certainly not to discourage starting things late. I started ballet, embarrassingly, in my 30s, and I will never be any good. It was
Why embarrassingly? That's amazing. I love that.
But I think that giving young women the opportunity to understand what it feels like to take up space, to empower oneself, which naturally has the beautiful residual effect of empowering others, she has to learn how to do that comfortably and how to manage the pushback that society will give. But if she's not practicing that along the way, and she's supposed to have that epiphany in college or something and then try to catch up, that's a remarkable disadvantage. So I don't feel like I have a clear prescription of how to do that as a parent. One thing that I use in my own daily life is, would that have happened to a man? Would that person have said that to me if I was a man? Would he have felt comfortable saying that to me if I was a man? And I realize it's a soft litmus test, but I feel like you know the answer to that, and if the answer is no, there's probably a problem with the behavior. And I think for parents, just recognizing, obviously, different kids, whatever gender, are going to be raised slightly differently, and not just because of gender, but I guess being very honest with yourself if you're treating, your different gender children remarkably differently, mentioning, holding yourself accountable to that.
Should we do Q&A?
Or a statement. Like,
Yeah,
may I
sure.
make a statement as the mother of a 15-year-old son? So I think the approach over time is probably is going to be most successful if mothers also work on raising sons who understand this concept, right?
Absolutely.
So, but also as a mother, you need to model taking up space, right? And being successful and showing your son that, I'm the shit, right? And when you get a girl, you want her to be like me or whatever partner you have. You want them to take up space, feel confident, and feel good about themselves. And I think the message to parents, that's not a message that is often communicated to parents, I would say.
I agree. Yeah.
As the mother of a son.
Yes. Absolutely. Yeah, I didn't learn. I mean, I did not. I was. My role in the family was to take care of everyone, and to be small and happy all the time. My middle name is Joy because I was meant to bring joy back to the family, and I had been always told a different story, but that's the real story. I didn't start to really individuate, honestly, until I was in my 40s. I was an overachiever, I have a lot of degrees and I did it well. I kept my head down. When I was in grad school, I just did my work, but I really didn't learn to do that until, my son was 10, 11 years old. And I'm only now going, actually, I am a deadhead. I am going to go back and follow the dead again. I am going to get back in roller skates and roller skate. I can be all of these things. I don't have to please people by shrinking myself into one little box. And that's what I was trying to be. I was trying to be just a Harvard professor, and that's it. And if you're a Harvard professor, you probably shouldn't do these other things because then you're that eccentric, kooky one, right? And who might have some loose screws. But really, actually, you're individuating when you're doing those things. I'd love to. I know we probably don't have much more time. How are we on time?
Oh, you're fine.
Okay. I do want to know, how should clinicians be treating anorexia? I mean, what should change in that approach?
I didn't really start to individuate until my 40s as well. Yeah, I started in my 30s. I'm in my 40s, yeah. 40s are fabulous, by the way.
Except I'm not 50, but yeah, they were great, yeah.
My advice to clinicians is to be honest and sincere about the fact that you don't really know what you're doing when it comes to anorexia. That's a heck of a statement. But it's not just out of my mouth, it's out of the mouths of a number of remarkable clinicians who said it in slightly different ways, some who said it precisely like that, who appear on the back cover of my book and inside. We know that because our outcomes haven't changed. And it's okay to not be clear, but that means that there is an onus on the medical establishment to continue down the path that some are already taking, that I deeply respect, to understand the patient's perspective, which will just simply help to dispel the myths in the clinicians' minds. It's not that the therapeutic answer lies with the patients necessarily, but we must first understand what we're dealing with, and that right now I think is not always the case. So if the underlying understanding of anorexia for a clinician is that it is a young woman whose life is out of control, which is, when you really think about it, anorectics tend to be extremely high-performing, extremely intelligent and capable. These are not out-of-control lives, generally. If that is your underlying premise, I would just challenge that and challenge it on the basis of, where has that really gotten me as a clinician? And I think another call to action really for clinicians, and this is not just from me, this is also from Dr. Insel and other remarkable psychiatrists, is increasing the level of accountability in the field in general, but especially in these areas where mortality is such a high risk, getting really clear about what those rates are. 10% of anorectics die in 10 years, 20% die in 20 years, and only a third ever recover to what one might call a life really worth living. Those are not good statistics. We can do much better. So I think just being willing to look at the underlying axiom and willing to invest in the research, as some, but probably not enough, we're doing.
I think that's a really good point, that even changing the way clinicians, therapists think about this changes the questions they ask and what they hear. It's very easy to ask leading questions when you have a concept in mind about who this person is. You're going to ask questions that will not consciously even, but you're going to ask the questions that give you the answers that conform to the concept that you hold. We have some audience questions. Would you like to take some?
Can I speak to what you just
Yes,
said?
of course.
Oh my goodness. I love so much what you just said. So I have the pleasure of working as an advisor to one of the companies that is doing work in anorexia right now. And one thing that they are looking at are eating disorder measures and some of the challenges of exactly that, the questions that are asked that are leading. And of course, I'm one of many people, all of whom are better qualified undoubtedly than I am, but I've had a voice at that table and it's been wonderful. One of the opportunities that I had was to read through the current measures and provide feedback on how they land as someone who would have met those measures. And some make perfect sense, but the eating disorder specific measure, I found it literally insulting with the severity of its leading questions. So there were multiple sets of questions, I won't remember exactly, but somewhere in the lines of 13, 14, 17, and every single set, no matter what particular area they were looking into, every single one wrapped with a question that said, I wish I remembered it exactly, but basically, are you doing this because you're trying to control your life? Literally this direct leading question. And by the time I got to the fourth or fifth, and I was almost furious. I thought, wow, you are convincing these women that that's what they're doing, and I will promise you, they're not.
Right, that's true, right? So you're the expert, and you are convincing them that this is why. And so now you both have a misunderstanding. So what is the chance for recovery if the understanding of the cause is held by both the patient and the clinician or the therapist? Should we do audience Q&A?
Yeah.
I'll let you call in.
Oh, okay. Sally in the back.
is a physical problem. They have no food. I mean, only eating disorder centers can really address it from both sides. That needs to change. Because it's either or, you know, should you treat your body or treat your mind? It's like, I need both.
I agree. It is a huge topic, right? It's a policy topic. I mean, this started, I don't know, decades ago when asylums were shut down for many wonderful reasons, but all the community-based mental health care that was supposed to stand in for that was defunded before it stood up, and we continue to deal with the outcome. It really comes down just to that. The history is pretty discouraging when you read it, but it comes down to that. So then we have this incredibly fractured system, and this affects everyone dealing with any health or mental health issue for sure. There's also something unique about eating disorders and anorexia in particular, and what I always say is my heart absolutely bleeds for anyone dealing with any eating disorder because it is a path to hell. Anorexia, I say, is the express train to hell, but they all get you to the same place. But my personal experience is in anorexia alone, so that's why I speak to them. But I think with anorexia or other eating disorders or other mental health disorders that cause extreme physiological issues as well. You know, first you got to make sure that the heart's firing, right? So I understand a little bit of the distinction between the two, but my fear is that for most, once you're sure that your heart is stable and you're refeeding to a certain level that you're not worried about a metabolic crisis, then you're fine. And it's a little bit like assuming that an eating disorder is about eating. I'd love it if we changed the name at some point. It's not the biggest problem, so I won't beat that drum too loudly, but it's not just about eating ever. It's about something so much more than that. And what they have in common is that there seems to be some effect on, the intake of food. But yes, I essentially agree. I don't have the answer, but I know that, the bridge that was meant to be built way back when probably still needs to be built.
It seems like it's more of the males, no disrespect to the males, that sort of stalled the whole process. And I find that as a parent, and it started with a pediatrician asking a question, and I'll never forget, well, do you snap? Was the question. And the response was, yes, I occasionally have a piece of licorice. And the doctor looked at me and said, oh, see, there you go. There's no problem here. And even with the male psychiatrist, it's just, one in particular, just doesn't seem to understand. And I feel that person is very judgmental. So is it because there's not enough women involved in the process of, this is just outrageous to me, that this cycle continues, and it doesn't seem to get better.
So the question is, and I'm sorry I should have repeated the original question too, is that, does this have something to do with the gender of the treating physician, and that the cycle continues, if that's a fair assessment of the question. I argue in my book that I absolutely believe there's a misogynistic issue going on with anorexia, that the rates as they affect women versus men at the age of onset, it's just too dramatic to ignore. And perhaps we'll find down the line I'm dead wrong and it is 100% genetic. I just really doubt it for all the reasons we've already discussed. I think empathy is important for all clinicians because you can't necessarily understand where everyone is coming from. So knowing that you don't understand where everyone is coming from and trying a lot harder is really important. But the error of the ways that you just described also is this sense that it has everything to do with food intake, and it simply doesn't. That's a symptom so far down the line. And it's certainly one that needs to be recovered and managed, because that's one that'll kill you. But it is merely a symptom, and it really does show up very far down the line. So yeah, I think there's a great opportunity for our therapists across the board, certainly psychiatrists and psychologists, to just better understand the disorder and have empathy for every person at every age. The last thing I'll say is I've said that I feel like the treatment of anorexia, based upon the not only the treatment protocols but the way it's viewed, reminds me a lot, having been scrutinized and judged and blamed in that way, reminds me a lot of what it must have felt like to be called hysterical way back when. I think we are there in the conversation around anorexia, and we are modernizing so many of our approaches to so many things. And I really do believe that a lot of this is just a call to modernize that perspective, because when you look at it and really look at it from all sides, it's actually a little bit embarrassing and ridiculous that that's still how we see it.
And I wanted to add that there's also a sort of a kind of simpler, kind of mathematical thing that happened, and that I think there's, in the last few years, people have started talking more and more about how, because more men were doing the research on in all areas of health, they were researching health issues that were more common for men. So for example, research on sex was almost always research. They were always studying men. Those were the men. Men were the subjects, and so it's sort of like all of these myths about women and sex. But we are so behind because of just selection bias. People study what's relevant to them. We call it me search. People do me search, and so if 90% of the people doing the research until 20 years ago, were men, they weren't that interested in studying this. So I think that's another part of another piece of the puzzle that is now getting corrected. And I think women's health, research in women's health is just, but it's on a very steep upward curve right now, which I think is great. Yeah.
I'm curious what you would say to someone my age or someone in my age of 15 to 20, for example, and the value of, I think you talked about a lot of important things, and I think there's also the value of friends, and especially in the age set of 15 to 20, when we start shifting from having strong parental connections, so a lot of people kind of moving towards I'm in school every day, 9 to 3, and I care about what my friends are thinking and all this stuff. And as well as the male gaze at that age starts to become a thing, and that's very important. But also how we can get people. I've always struggled with empathizing with eating disorders because I've had one, and it's not something that men struggle with. And how we can get boys to empathize, and how we can get friends to not only recognize, but how to act, how to engage others.
What a great question. So this question comes from someone who I happen to know is 20 years old, about the what might be said to those in the age group of 15 to 20 around the value of friends, and the challenge that eating disorders do affect women to men across the board at a rate of 2 to 1. Of course, anorexia we've talked about is 10 to 1, but it's just less common in men, though that certainly exists in men. And how to empathize in this area where you feel like you have no way of relating. I love that question so much. I think it's those who had no way of relating and judged based upon their discriminatory bias who came to the conclusion that we're now trying to fight. So how lovely to have someone say, hey, I don't understand this at all. How would I even approach this? That's the proper path. That's amazing. Friends are crucial because, as you said, this is happening at the time where your parents aren't going to weigh quite as heavily on your decision making, and you're starting to kind of learn how to do that on your own, but your friends suddenly start to take up a lot more of that kind of psychological space where your parents did. I credit my best friend in high school with literally saving my life alongside my mother, and it was her grace and her warmth and her acceptance, and really just the levity, the joy that I had just let bleed out, that she brought back into my life, that really, I think, saved me. She also wrote the epilogue, and as I like to say, if you're a smart writer, you put someone better than you at the beginning and the end, is what I was able to do. So her story is really profound as well. But I think friends are crucial at that time, and just recognizing what you don't know, not blaming, not accusing. They know something's going on. You don't necessarily need to be reminded. I would argue that the type of eating disorder that I went through is a matter of restriction. So anywhere that you can find a way that they can soften those restrictions, food will be the hardest. Don't start there. That can start to open the door for a different perspective. And it sounds so simple and so light, but it is everything. So Emily, my very best friend at that time, was able to bring music into my world, which was absolutely huge. And just laughter and hilarity for its own sake. That was huge. I know, no one's gonna break open a textbook and say, what solves anorexia? Laughter. But man, when everything is dark and dismal and horrible, just that fracture is huge. So yeah, I think friends are crucial. Blame and criticism, no matter what a person is going through, never helps. And the desire for empathy alone will take you very far. And then how do you cross that hurdle from wanting to empathize to empathizing? It's absolutely just listening and getting out of the way.
It does seem like responding to a friend who's struggling with an eating disorder is not totally unlike responding to a friend who's struggling with any addiction. It's frustrating. You just think, if you just stop, your life would be better. I don't get it. Why are you doing this? And it becomes super judgy very, very quickly. And you're already self-isolating when you're dealing with these things. And so that judgment just makes you shut down and pull away even more. So it is delicate. But yeah, friends seem to be really important. I just watched the documentary about Alanis Morissette, which I was talking about last or 2 nights ago, and I loved it. She's amazing. And she struggled with an eating disorder, and it was also her best friend who walked into the bathroom when she was making herself throw up, and she just said, "Hey, let's talk about that." She said, "No judgment, just hey, let's talk about that." And she said that's where the recovery began, with somebody who, because she felt that I think her parents couldn't, they were intentionally blind to it. They couldn't cope with it, so they didn't talk about it. But yeah, less judgment. I want to give you the mic. Is there anything that you want to share that you really want people to know, and that I haven't given you a chance to answer in any of my questions?
I want everyone to know how grateful I am to have Amy Cuddy here this evening, and how gracious you are to spend your time with me and with all of us and on this topic. I really, really appreciate you. I'm so thankful to every one of you for coming out this evening, again, for caring to take the time to take the Uber to be here. I'm just so grateful. I would be remiss if I didn't say words directly to someone who is battling an eating disorder, and I can never do this without tearing up, so we'll see if I make it this time. What I wish I had heard at that time, and could somehow be convinced of, was that I was enough. Just simply that I was enough as I was. So let me just say, you are enough. You came that way. You will always be that way. There is nothing you can do to change that fact. You are absolutely enough, and you are worth every bit of the effort to walk yourself into a life that you find to be worth living.
Thank you. And you're signing, is that right? So Dawn will be over here signing if you'd like to chat with her for a minute. Thanks. Yeah, thank you for coming.